In this session, we're going to discuss two of the other strands of early rock and roll. The streams, if you remember, I posited that there were six. We've already talked about the harmony groups, the doo-wop groups, and those are largely black groups. There were some white doo-wop groups. We talked about the crew cuts and so on, but they tend to be more on the pop side of things. So we have the pop artists like the Everly Brothers and Pat Boone, and I would put the crew cuts on that side, even though they're clearly emulating the doo-wop sounds of the harmony groups that were recorded by record companies like Atlantic. We already talked about the northern bands, such as Bill Haley. His band is the most famous of that style. And again, we're dealing with a white group. We talked about Elvis, of course, and rockabilly sound, which was by almost definition white, since that was the idea for Sam Phillips, was that he was trying to find a white performer that had the black sound. That was what he specifically said he was looking for. So we've dealt with four of these streams, and today we'll deal with two others, and they're both oriented toward black performers. The New Orleans sound on the one hand, and then the Chicago blues, the legacy of the Chicago blues on the other. So really, New Orleans in the Cosimo Matassa studio, and then Chicago in the Chess Records studio with Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley, and of course New Orleans we have Little Richard and Fats Domino. So one's more piano-based, the New Orleans sound is more piano-based, the Chicago sound more guitar-based. Now, even though I said that we can see this as basically being 3 plus 3, where 3 of the streams focus on white performers and 3 on black performers, make no mistake, all of the white performers there are drawing on black sounds. That's the whole point of rock and roll, is this kind of eclecticism, right? And this idea of drawing from various genres. But a key ingredient of that is that R&B sound from the jump blues of Louis Jordan and the crooner blues of Charles Brown and so on, that you're drawing from these various traditions of various styles in this rather eclectic manner. So a great deal of cross-cultural interaction, so to speak. And what we want to do now is trace how that worked with the New Orleans sound and with the Chicago sound coming out of the Chicago blues into something that we might more recognizably think of as rock and roll. Fats Domino is the first figure we're going to talk about here. He had his first R&B hit with The Fat Man in 1949. In 1950, it charted as number 6 R&B. And this was on the independent record label Imperial Records. He was only 21 at the time, but he already had a sort of sophisticated look. He always looked a little older than he actually was, which I think was part of his, in a way, acceptability, or contributed to his acceptability for audiences. And he really is a very important crossover audience. He strongly appealed to both black and white audiences, as we'll see. He had his first R&B number 1 with the song Going Home, which is a great tune. Many of his hits were co-written by Dave Bartholomew, and we'll talk a bit about who that is soon, but he's a major figure, producer, and songwriter at Cosimo Matassa's studio. Fats Domino's first major crossover hit was with Ain't It a Shame from 55 rather, which was a number 10 pop song and a number 1 R&B. So that was his first important crossover. And then he becomes the second largest selling record artist of the 1950s, just behind Elvis. And so that's a quite impressive record, right? These two gentlemen sold quite a few records over the course of the 1950s. Between 55 and 63, he had 37 top 40 singles. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about Fats Domino, other than the image, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in a moment, one of the things that's interesting about him is just the eclecticism, right? He creates this, he's clearly coming out of a kind of more relaxed New Orleans version of jump blues. But he's also drawing on Tin Pan Alley styles and so on. I mean, his 56 hit, Blueberry Hill, which was number 2 pop and number 1 R&B for 11 weeks, so quite a long period. That was a Tin Pan Alley song, right? And it was already a hit in 1940 for Glenn Miller, the famous swing band leader And so this is a tune that, for young people in 1956, this is a tune that their parents were very familiar with. This was a tune that was already 16 years, it's been 16 years since it was originally a big hit. Now, I don't want to present this as though this is Fats Domino trying to appeal across generations, because for the most part that's not his appeal. His appeal really was with the youth market. But what I think is interesting about his take on Blueberry Hill is that it shows the eclecticism of rock and roll. I mean, yeah, we talk about the six streams, we talk about the idea that and we have this image of rock and roll as having certain characteristics, the emphasis on the backbeat, right? It's got a backbeat, you can't lose it. The emphasis on electrified instruments and so on, although that's not true of Fats Domino. And in fact, a lot of that's not true of Fats Domino. There is a backbeat, but it doesn't have that same kind of hard-hitting backbeat that we see in other forms of music necessarily, especially not in Fats Domino's approach, although we'll see that the heavy backbeat becomes a hallmark of the New Orleans style. There's an eclecticism to the approaches to the genre, the overarching genre of rock and roll, that's important to keep in mind. So Tin Pan Alley music is not alien to rock and roll, right? We sometimes think of that as being a hallmark of the early 60s in the Brill Building approach, but that's not true. It's already there in the 50s, this eclecticism. Now, of course, Fats Domino has his own style, and it's very much indicative of a wider New Orleans style, especially the fact that it's derived from Boogie Woogie, but it's a much smoother style than the Boogie Woogie approach. A smoother sense of flow, smoother sense of that underlying beat. And you have the characteristic Fats Domino triplets, right, which are these sort of very wide approaches to swing, the da 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 da, where there's an emphasis, there's a sort of gentle emphasis, especially with Fats, not so much with Little Richard. We'll get to that in a moment, but with Fats, there's a gentle emphasis on that one, on the downbeat, the da 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 da. But then the triplet figure after that kind of flows out of it, right, and it sort of follows along from that gentle emphasis. And then you can see here from this promotional picture that Fats Domino has a very non-confrontational, relaxed image. Many even thought of him as being more of a country and western singer than an R&B singer, and that's partly because of just the emphasis on crossover at this time, right? It's not at all odd at this time, right? And think of it this way too, that when we get to the 60s, we'll see that black artists have a hard time breaking through in country, but at this time, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, they're appearing on the country charts. And part of that has to do with just this weird moment in the 50s where it's not that the 50s are wonderfully desegregated. We know that that's a false narrative, and that rock and roll doesn't break down racial barriers the way that people sometimes think of it as having done when they're looking back on it with romanticized nostalgia. But rather, there's a strange phenomenon that's happening in the 50s where that which is selling well is just selling well, and the youth culture is sort of absorbing all these different styles and calling it rock and roll, so that rock and roll doesn't really even have an identity in any musical characteristic sense. It has a multiple or schizophrenic identity. It's really about the promotional aspect of it and the marketing aspect of it. So you can see here, this picture I think is really interesting in a number of ways. Notice that he's kind of hunched into the frame. Now the frame was probably, cut in order to emphasize that hunched character, but something about that is there's something kind of welcoming with his smile. He's sort of bringing you into the picture. Notice also the relaxed attitude. There's a certain amount of tension in that hand, at least the one finger that's extended, but then there's an overall relaxed sensibility, and even the way that he has his his left foot there slightly upturned, right? This isn't a picture of a virtuoso, even though he is something of a virtuoso at the piano. This isn't a picture that's meant to emphasize that aspect of things. It's meant to emphasize a more relaxed approach, a welcoming approach, an affability. He recorded largely at Cosimo Matassa's studio. A lot of his most famous hits were recorded there, and that's what we'll turn to next. That's what we want to talk about in the following slides. Cosimo Matassa, in 1945, he opens J&M Recording Studio in the back of a family jukebox shop, right? So his family runs a jukebox shop in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Now, those of you who are familiar with New Orleans, whether you've been there or not, you've probably heard of the French Quarter, right? The French Quarter is famous for its theatrical district. It's famous for its various music venues and restaurants. It's adjacent to the red light district, right? We talked about Storyville with the early jazz, and even though Storyville officially closed, there was a red light district on the border of the French Quarter. So it's an area for entertainment. It's an area, as you can tell from the name, French Quarter, that has a very heavy Cajun presence, right? Very heavy Cajun culture. And it's really a mixing of cultures and an area that emphasizes entertainment. Now, the other thing you probably know, whether you've been to New Orleans or not, is that it has a long history going back to the late 18th century at least, and really back before that to its founding, right? As soon as it was a French colonial port, from the very beginning, it had a reputation as being a center for musical production. Now, this is important because you have all these different approaches to music in a very concentrated area. These highly professional musicians, very inspired musicians, and there's no recording studio prior to 1945. When Cosimo Matassa opens that small studio in the back of his family's jukebox store, there is no competition. All this talent and no place to record it. The musicians who had a national profile, of course, they would go up to Chicago and then later to Memphis in order to record. But in 1945, really, there wasn't any place locally to record. And you have all this talent. So you have bands that are national, of course, and they can go wherever to record. But the local talent, they're not recording really much at all, right? So Cosimo Matassa has this large roster, really, of talent in front of him that he can record and that no one else is recording. So for a while, he's the only one going. In the next 10 years, of course, some competition does arise. By 1955, there are a couple of other small studios, and that's when he opens the Cosimo Recording Studio, a larger studio. And it's really still one of the only recording studios in the city full of musicians and performances. And so his studio, especially because it's the nicest one, is in pretty high demand. That studio doesn't actually stay open very long, as we'll see, but it has a huge impact on the recording industry, and so did his earlier studio. In the beginning, he only had 2 Presto 8N recorders, so he could do no intercutting and no tape editing. So that meant that every performance was a real live performance that was caught on tape. And you can hear that when you hear those early recordings. It comes across very clearly that there's a live aspect to it. But there's also some bleeding. If those of you who can listen carefully and discern that kind of thing, you'll hear that the drums bleed into the other tracks and so on. And that gives it some of the warmth that it has. And this becomes a sound that other recording studios will emulate. Of course, Cosimo Matassa has other things that are benefiting his sound, other talents that he's drawing from. Let's take a look at some of that. For instance, 2 of the people that are working closely with him are the producers Dave Bartholomew and Alan Toussaint. And they really help define the New Orleans pop music sound at this time. Dave Bartholomew is a really brilliant producer in a lot of ways. He knew how to write songs that were going to be these novelty hits. And in the 50s, there are a lot of those. Some of the Little Richard hits were really novelty hits. Some of the Chuck Berry hits, although fewer of those. But there were also, at Cosimo Matassa's studio, there's these songs where, for instance, one of the singers, whose nickname was Frogmouth, sings songs in the style of a frog, right, with this kind of croaking voice. And Dave Bartholomew wrote a lot of those kinds of songs. The song My Ding-a-Ling was co-written by Dave Bartholomew. So a lot of these little novelty songs that become popular were written by him. And he also had a way of recording vocals and making sure they were recorded that really pop within this overall context of the studio sound that they get with that studio, with Matassa's studio. Moreover, Kazuma Watasa had working for him some of the best studio musicians of the period. And this was an integrated group. It was an integrated ensemble at a time when the racial divide in New Orleans was still very strong and prominent, and influenced a lot of other businesses and other approaches to expression. He was able to have an integrated band. One of the most important members of that band was, of course, Earl Palmer, who was the drummer. He was known as the heaviest backbeat in early rock and roll, and really his sound is very distinctive, and we'll see a picture of him in a bit, but that's a major part of how this sounds. And we've been talking on and off about some important studio musicians. We talked about Chet Atkins, for instance, and Floyd Kramer, the country guitarist. We've talked about Scotty Moore and Bill Black working with Elvis. And I would say that these musicians that we're talking about today, the New Orleans musicians, they're some of the most important in the country at this time. So you also have guitarist Ernest McLean, the very important keyboardist Huey Piano Smith, and then the saxophonist Lee Allen and Alvin Red Taylor. And combined, they give those recordings of some of the early recordings of Ray Charles, and then the Little Richard recordings, the Fats Domino recordings. They really give it that flavor. And some of these guys even go on tour with Fats Domino, and so they're sometimes known as the Fats Domino Band, but their main gig really was as studio musicians there in New Orleans at Kazuma Watasa's studio. And a string of hits come out of this studio. You have hits like The Fat Man, of course, which we already talked about with Fats Domino. Tutti Frutti, of course, right? The Little Richard hit. And then you have Lawdy Miss Clawdy by Lloyd Price. Mother-in-Law by Ernie K. Doe. Tipatina by Professor Longhair, who you see there. Great pianist, Professor Longhair. The Roy Brown version, one of the better versions, I think, of Good Rockin' Tonight was recorded there. The Big Joe Turner version of Shake, Rattle, and Roll, right? Big Joe Turner, who really recorded all over the country, Chicago, New York, and so on. Some of his most famous and most important R&B recordings are made right there in New Orleans. And then, of course, Fats Domino and Little Richard and Dr. John, some of the early Ray Charles, Lee Dorsey, that's all being recorded at Kazuma Watasa's studio. So it's a very important studio as far as the history of recorded music is concerned. So the New Orleans sound is part of the reason so many of these artists, both big and small, are coming to the studio is because of that sound, right? So you have the strong drums provided by Earl Palmer, the heavy guitar. What I mean by heavy guitar isn't really distorted guitar, although it has some minor distortion through just the reverberation of the room. But really, I'm talking about the hits on the beats, right? You'll hear this very heavy, strummy sound. It's not a very ornate approach to accompaniment for the most part. And then you have the lighter horn sound. So in other words, that's kind of the reverse of the jump blues sound. The jump blues sound tended to have a lighter rhythm section and then a heavier horn sound, a more abrasive horn sound. And the New Orleans sound is the reverse of that, with a lighter horn sound, a lighter horn line, accompanied by a really driving rhythm section. Not that they couldn't be lighter. Certainly with a lot of the Fats Dominoes, there's a sort of lightness there. But listen to the rhythm section. It's still got this emphasis, this drive to it that is really kind of interesting because it's combined, especially in his music. That's part of what I like about Fats Domino. Was his approach is so relaxed, and Earl Palmer is really good about pulling behind the beat, but then knowing when to get just ahead of the beat, just enough to give certain things emphasis. He's really a complex and really interesting drummer, a real stylist in that sense. And then you have the strong lead vocals, like I said, in part because of Dave Bartholomew. Now, Kazuma Watasa closes the studio, this version of it, in 1956. So that version of the studio was only open for a little more than a year. And he opened 2 other studios, but neither of them created the landmark recordings that this one in the previous studio had. And yet those really left an indelible mark on the sound of rock and roll. Let's switch our focus now to Chicago. We've already been talking about Chicago and the sound of the chest sound, right? I mentioned, for instance, the way that they got reverb, their particular brand of reverb, was by suspending a microphone over a toilet in a room adjacent to where the singer was working. And Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley both wind up recording at Chess Studios, so two of these very important figures in early rock and roll. Early in 1953, Chuck Berry's already making an impact on the scene. He's very much in the style of T-Bone Walker. But unlike T-Bone Walker, he's also very influenced by country music. And he's interested in a series of both Grand Ole Opry stars, but also Western swing, and he's drawing on that in a lot of his music. He goes to Chicago in 1955 to try to break into the music industry, and Muddy Waters hears him play. He recommends to Chess Records that they record him, which they start doing in 55. He releases Maybelline, and that's very much modeled on a country tune called Ida Red, which was recorded by both Roy Acuff, the great star of the Grand Ole Opry, and Bob Wills, who is, of course, the main figure behind Western Swing. Now, Berry's approach to this is inspired both the lyrics, right? Ida Red, Maybelline, a similar rhythm to them. And you'll hear, if you listen to the vocal line, you'll hear something very similar in Ida Red and Maybelline. But, and the shuffle feel he's getting from those predecessors. But his sound, his approach to it is quite different, right? Again, the idea of copyright is pretty loose at this time. We'll see that Chuck Berry is kind of an important part of the copyright history when he sues the Beach Boys, and we'll talk about that next semester. But he's able to take quite a few elements from songs like Ida Red, in part because they're just shuffle elements, blues-related shuffle elements, but he changes them a good deal as well. He gets a very different sound with them, in part because of that distorted guitar, in part because of that very loose approach to rhythm that then kicks in. So his version, Maybelline, is very fast, which should make it hard to articulate the words. But listen to that track now, and then come back. And one of the things that you'll notice is that even though the tempo is fairly fast, so it's a pretty fast medium shuffle, I'd say, and the text is delivered in a rapid-fire machine gun-like manner, you could still hear all the words. He articulates it really well. In a way, it's kind of almost a percussive articulation, but it doesn't feel overly percussive, right? It feels you're caught up in the personality of the delivery, but at the same time there's a percussive element to it. So he pulls it off quite well, and you can hear all the words. This and most of his other songs betray the deep influence of country, the shuffle feel, and the vocal inflections. That's another thing that he takes from country. But the song also tells a story. In fact, he's known for his story songs, as we'll see on the next slide. In this case, the story is really a story based on romance and on youth culture, with the emphasis on cars and flirting and dating and so on. And there's also an element of class relations, I would say, right? Because it's all about this girl, Maybelline, who has a Coupe de Ville, so therefore she obviously has a shiny new car that's more expensive. He's driving an old Ford Model T, which is a more affordable model. So there's a class distinction. And that, of course, is very typical in films from the 50s and early 60s, this idea of the boy from the rough side of the tracks courting this girl who's led a more privileged life, right? And he's getting her in part because of his daring or whatever, his insistence and his willingness to sort of vie with her. And that's what's happening here, right? So there's this flirtatious element, and he tells the story in this very rapid, very imagistic way. So he mentions, for instance, the water, the rain, and the water's doing his engine good. And there's some, you might think of that as a kind of double entendre, that the lubrication, right, for his engine. We don't need to go too far into that. I think you can see what I'm trying to suggest, or what maybe the song's suggesting. But notice that the refrain doesn't seem to fit that, right? Maybelline, why can't you be true? He just says over and over again. So you're mixing in this element of a story song with a sort of more traditional blues line there. She's not his girlfriend yet, so how is infidelity even an issue? And so you can wonder about time frames, perhaps. Maybe one is in the present, why can't you be true? And then he's remembering back in the past. Maybe it's two different protagonists. I don't know. So these story songs, and they're not always super clear stories, but they're very imagistic, right? This becomes a major part of how he makes his living. So it's very much embedded in teen culture. This idea of school days, of these songs that have to do with school, songs that have to do with some kind of guitar-like hero, like Johnny Be Good or Sweet Little 16, about a young girl at her 16th birthday party, a sort of coming of age kind of song. School Days was a number 3 pop and number 1 R&B in 57. Johnny Be Good, of course, number 8 pop, number 2 R&B in 58. Sweet Little 16, number 2 pop, number 1 R&B. So again, this crossover phenomenon, like so many of the ones that we've been talking about, is such a big part of rock and roll era. Now, of course, the thing that Chuck Berry is perhaps most famous for is that he's a guitar hero, right? Along with Scotty Moore, he's probably one of the most important guitarists of the early rock and roll era. Notice the emphasis that he makes on the 2-string guitar shuffle and the lower strings, right? Where you're alternating a power chord, a root and a fifth, with the root and a sixth. So that that goes back, of course, to the blues and the really all the way back to country blues, and gets modernized in the Chicago blues and the jump blues. But here, with that little bit of distortion, that little bit of drive, and especially in Johnny Be Good, you can hear that it takes on this sort of characteristic rock and roll element. He's also famous for the double stops, right? So listen to the opening of Johnny Be Good. Notice especially the way that even though we're in 4/4, he groups them in 3 at first, right? So you have da 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 kind of thing, right? That 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, and then it lines back up with the underlying 4. Also, you'll notice that descending line is basically just outlining the major tonic, and it outlines it in part with the hammer on that goes from the minor third to the major third. So in other words, the blue note, right? A hammer on is where you pluck one, you're holding one note and you pluck it, and then you force your finger down. So it gives it this kind of almost bendy sound. Of course, Chuck Berry also uses in that same opening, that very famous opening of Johnny Be Good, he also uses some string bends. In fact, he uses what's sometimes thought of as an oblique bend, which I think is worth mentioning. When he's playing over the 4 chord, he's still playing the F for the most part. So there's a kind of F pedal that goes on in part of the Johnny Be Good introduction, where he's bending on the 3rd string of the guitar. He's bending the E flat up to an F, and then he's hitting the F on the B string. So that gives it the sense of bending up, so this movable note that's then on a stable note, F, right? But basically it's just this pedal F. At first you're hearing the F over the B flat chord, and of course it's just a fifth of that chord, but then you also hear the F over the E flat chord, and it becomes the 9th. It becomes an unstable note, and then returns to the B flat. The other thing he does in that opening that I think is interesting is he doesn't outline the dominant. Really, he doesn't outline anything but the tonic chord. He just keeps playing tonic arpeggiations over each of the chords, with a little more emphasis on that blue note. So it does seem like he's kind of arpeggiating the 4 chord, but the dominant chord, he doesn't emphasize it at all. That also gives it this kind of blues feel, a kind of looseness over the changes. He's not articulating the changes. There's this looser feel in general. So you have the double stops, you have the slides, the bends, this looser rhythmic approach. All that contributes to his signature sound. Of course, he's also known for his stage presence and his movements with the guitar. He tends to, when he's standing still singing, you can see he's sort of moving the guitar in this kind of almost dance-like fashion. When he's not singing, he's taking his solo. He'll sometimes do the duck walk, where he kind of, and you can see the top picture, actually both pictures are depicting that, where he kind of bends down a bit and then he kicks one foot out in front of the other and kind of hops, and it's known as the duck walk. These are just ways of showing antics, in a way, stage antics that show off a bit and capture people's attention, some bit of novelty, right? He's also somewhat famous for having held his guitar kind of low. He has it slung low, with the straps loose, so that it hangs low down toward his and the lower part of his pelvis or whatever, and when he bends over like that, down to his between his legs at times. It's not the easiest way to play guitar, at least not for me and for plenty of other players. Look at pictures of Buddy Holly or Richie Valens, or most of the Chet Atkins. Most guitarists hold the guitar up higher. Eddie Cochran, they all have it up higher. But this idea of holding it lower becomes quite popular as a sort of image for rock and roll as well, right? Think of Jimmy Page. Now, sometimes that creates a sloppier approach to playing, but I don't think anyone can accuse Chuck Berry of being sloppy. The other thing that's important about Chuck Berry that you can see in that lower slide, that's actually from his nightclub. He opened his own integrated nightclub in St. Louis, and you can see there's white and black audiences, and they're not separated by a rope or anything else. They're not in separate parts of the room. They're all mixed in together. And that was his Berry's Club Bandstand in St. Louis. And that was a good business decision on his part, right? Obviously, the music industry can be something of a problem at this time in the 50s. And I'll mention it now since we've already mentioned it. He winds up pursuing copyright issues. For instance, when Surfin' USA comes out, which is clearly just a reworking of Sweet Little 16, he sues, rightly so, the Beach Boys, and he wins and has to get royalties for that song. But in the 50s, that was quite difficult still, right? That takes place in the 60s. But that was quite difficult. Getting everything you were due from a record company was quite difficult in the 50s. And it continued to be for some people in the 60s. So investing in real estate, investing in a nightclub, that was a good idea for him. And it was a place where he would promote his own music and play there. And so it had a certain cachet. He could promote other artists and so get into that end of the business. So for a while there in the mid-50s, everything was coming up Chuck Berry. I mean, he had the world by the tail, so to speak. But things then go kind of wrong for him, as we'll see in the next slide. And unfortunately, it's partly his fault. There are arguments to be made, I suppose, that he winds up being persecuted more than others. He made that argument. He felt that he was persecuted for his crime more than other people had been, and that part of it was because of his integrated band, his integrated nightclub, and his influence on white audiences, and that therefore he was thought of as being something of a dangerous entity. But he did break the law in a way that I think most of us would find pretty seriously objectionable. He was arrested at the very end of 1959. And he's in the courts on and off for the next 2 years. It's not until January of 1962 that he's finally sentenced. And he's sentenced to 3 years under the Mann Act. Now, the Mann Act is where you can't transport someone who's underage over state lines for illicit purposes, usually for sex. And he did. He transported a 14-year-old girl across state lines. He claims it wasn't to have sex with her. She claims it was. And, it doesn't seem likely that he was framed the way that he sometimes has claimed. At other times he says that he wasn't framed, but he was just persecuted more than others. Either way, it's a sordid tale. It's not a pleasant thing to discuss, obviously. But what it does is it removes him from the scene. And he's an interesting cautionary tale, as is Little Richard, who we'll talk about next. Little Richard removed himself from the scene. But by the time they both came back, I mean, he's back out. Chuck Berry's back out by 64, 65, and he starts playing again. But just in those 5 years, from the end of the 50s into the middle of the 60s, he's already thought of as being a kind of nostalgia act. Right? He still has a certain amount of cachet, in part because of the Beach Boys, in part because of this continuation of that sound. But when he plays, even though he's still fairly young in the mid-60s and he's still writing music and so on, he's already thought of as something of a nostalgia act, and it embitters him. He's not pleased about this at all, and he becomes a very difficult person in a lot of ways. He doesn't like the idea of being on these. He winds up not touring under his own steam, so to speak. He tours in these rock and roll reviews, which is, the platform for a kind of nostalgia. And this is a guy who's, like I said, he's certainly not aged at that point, and he's thought of as being something of a throwback. So he's jailed right when he's at the height of his powers, height of his career. Now, Little Richard has a very different trajectory to his career. But he too disappears from the scene by the end of the 50s. Actually, earlier than Chuck Berry, as we'll see. In 1948, he's kicked out of his home by his father because his father objects to his effeminate mannerisms. Little Richard is a rather effeminate man in a lot of ways. The exact nature of his sexuality he discusses at different times of his life and in different interviews, and but he was obviously very open to alternate forms of sexual expression, and his father did not appreciate that. And sort of planted it in his head rather early that he was bound for hell and so on, and then we'll see that has an impact on his later career. So he joins Dr. Hudson's medicine show, and he develops this drag persona. And by 1950, he's in a vaudeville group called the Sugarfoot Sam, and he performs in drag as Princess Lavon. Now, Princess Lavon, you can see the picture there of four of the drag queens from this show. Princess Lavon is a rather bawdy alternative personality for Little Richard, and it allows him to express the kind of extravagance that he will later use in his act as Little Richard. This extravagant theatricality. He'll tone down some of the more alternative sexual expression and to be a little more heteronormative. But this really allows him to refine his craft in that way. He's already recording a bit for RCA and for Peacock Records by 1951, but he's finding no success. He's not having any luck with it. And so he's looking to have a R&B or, what we now would think of as a rock and roll act. He's looking to move away from his drag queen show, but he's not having a whole lot of success at first until his breakthrough, which is in February of 1955, and he finds himself working for Art Rupe's Specialty Records. Specialty Records is one of the really interesting independent record companies of the 1950s. And at this point, he's recording with the producer Robert Bumps Blackwell at Matassa's studio. So he's in New Orleans, and he's working with Fats Domino's band and those studio musicians of Matassa's studio. And he really wants to get that heavy sound, that New Orleans sound, that bigger than life piano-led band sound with the horn lines and everything else. And Bumps Blackwell is another one who's a really interesting producer. He sort of will change over the course of his career. We'll talk about him a lot next semester. He works with Ray Charles. He's important in the history of Sam Cooke and several other artists. He really takes a stand for a lot of his artists, and so he's interested in letting artists kind of create their own sound. Well, one day apparently, the legend has it that Little Richard is getting a little frustrated in the recording studio. Things aren't going that well. He's not finding what he's looking for. And in part, just to blow off steam, he starts playing a song called Tutti Frutti, which was one that he used as Princess Lavon. He's doing this partly just out of frustration during a break. And the original lyrics of this song were Tutti Frutti, good booty. If it don't fit, don't force it. You can grease it, make it easy. It's a pretty open song about anal sex. That's clearly what he's describing, greasing up one's body for anal sex. It's clearly the kind of song that you're not going to put out on any record label in the mid-1950s. It's just not going to happen. And he's not presenting it as such. He's just, like I said, blowing off steam. But Bumps Blackwell hears it. He says, actually, that's your hit. We just got to fix these lyrics. Right? But everything, at this point, I think, at least again, legend has it, that at this point, Little Richard thinks of it all as kind of a joke, right? That he's been recording all these tunes, he's not happy with any of them, and then some bawdy tune that he used to do before as a total send-up, as a total joke, this is the one that gets Blackwell's attention. And so he just keeps trying to shock Blackwell, apparently, and comes up with dirtier and dirtier lyrics. Now, I have no idea what those are, because nobody seems to write them down, and it might all just be part of legend. It's hard to say. But what's not part of legend is what they do next. What they do is they hire a woman named Dorothy Labostri. Dorothy Labostri's job, her employment, is to work for Hallmark Cards. She writes little poems for anniversaries and birthdays and, your grandma's birthday and stuff like that. These little, what a Hallmark poem is like. They're anodyne. They're totally inoffensive, not usually all that interesting, right? Little glib poems. That's what she does for a living. And she's tasked. She, of course, is shocked. She's the one that you get a lot of these stories from. She hears what Little Richard's doing. She's totally shocked and doesn't even want to be in the same room with him for a little while because she's so shocked by the grotesque nature of the lyrics. But she comes up with this basically nonsense set of lyrics. Tutti frutti, oh Rudy, right? All this kind of stuff. And it winds up being a huge hit in 1955. It was number 2 R&B, number 17 pop, and it was a good hit for him. It made his reputation, where you have sort of his wild delivery, because he still does all the high pitched oohs and everything else he was doing with the original Tutti Frutti, but now it has these lyrics that are acceptable by anyone, right? I mean, in a way, they're nonsense lyrics. They're just novelty lyrics. Now, unfortunately, again, remember, copyright laws aren't so great, or aren't so, I mean, on the one hand, you could say they are great. They're not very restrictive, but on the other hand, it allows for a lot of abuse, and Little Richard is someone who suffers this abuse, because Pat Boone winds up covering this song while it's on the charts. Pat Boone, of course, had a much larger record company with a lot more promotional money behind him, and he outcharts and displaces Little Richard from the charts almost immediately and reaches number 12 on the pop charts, whereas the highest Little Richard got was 17, and then Little Richard, of course, starts to drop. And he replaces the screaming elements with, just these oohs and snapping of the fingers. And you can find plenty of footage from TV performances of Pat Boone doing Tutti Frutti. And he also covers he covers Good Golly Miss Molly. He covers a few of the Little Richard hits. And Little Richard thought of him as kind of an albatross around his neck, that every time he has a hit, here's Pat Boone in his sweater coming out to do a really watered down version of what Little Richard's already considering somewhat watered down music once Dorothy Labastri and other producers get to it. Here's another one of the downsides of these cover versions and the machinations behind all that. Now, Little Richard had 9 more hits on the top 40, including Long Tall Sally, which was the number 1 R&B and number 6 pop in 56, and Good Golly Miss Molly, which made it to number 10 pop, and then, of course, like I said, Pat Boone got to it. His shows were very theatrical. He had the flicker lights, basically strobe lights before there was such a thing. Mixed race performers. He had both black and white performers working for him. Sometimes mixed race audiences, although that's been exaggerated. One of the stories he likes to tell in a lot of documentaries and interviews is that they would put up the ropes in especially the southern venues where the black kids were on one side and the white kids on the other, and they would tear down the rope and everyone would dance together. That story got told so often that some researchers actually looked into it. They looked at police reports, they looked at newspaper reports. All that was greatly exaggerated, especially in the South. I mean, Little Richard didn't actually like touring in the South. If you read interviews from the actual time and not from his later memory or misremembering, he didn't like touring in the South because segregation was so harsh. They didn't have people divided by a rope. They had the black kids were up in the balcony area, and the white kids were on the floor usually. Some of the northern venues might have had the rope and so on. So anyway, it gets exaggerated. It doesn't mean it's not important. Some of it is a matter of ideology, right? It's what they believe the spirit of the music was doing, and that's important too. But at the same time, it's important to know what actually happened, I suppose. He often screamed in that wild way of his, that those high notes that he was rightly proud of, sang in a kind of wild manner. Sometimes he'd jump on top of the piano. He'd prop a leg on the piano while he's still playing it and pound it on the keys. He's sort of the wild musical alternative or maniacal alternative to Fats Domino, whereas Fats Domino was very demure, very accessible, very welcoming. There was something a little crazed about Little Richard, and that was part of the fun of it, obviously. that crazed element didn't stop him from being a huge success, obviously. In May of 57, he released the album Here's Little Richard, which was number 13 on the Billboard album charts. Remember that the only other major artist to have an album in the 50s was Elvis, right? And also on the charts. So this was a major accomplishment. Most of these artists are singles-based artists. Most of the 50s, that's what it was, outside of jazz. It was a singles-based market at that time. So they're really, both Elvis and Little Richard, they're projecting where things are going to go in the 60s, where things become more album oriented. But in the 50s, for the most part, that wasn't the case. So the fact that he had a number 13 album, whereas the albums were really dominated by pop, like really straightforward Bing Crosby type pop, and then jazz, that's where the albums were, right? R&B, rock and roll, country, those were singles based forms of musical expression in the 50s. Now in late 57, Little Richard's in Sydney, Australia. He's touring in Sydney, Australia, and he sees Sputnik go by, Sputnik 1. And he sees it as a giant red fireball streaking across the sky. A Sputnik, in case you're not remembering your political history, was a Russian satellite, right? And it was part of the space war, part of the space race that was part of the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. And Sputnik was a major event and had a lot of people afraid that Russia was going to, or Soviet Union rather, was going to win out when it came to the Cold War, that they were going to be the technological masters of the 20th century and that the U.S. would fall behind. And as you know, probably, that was a big part of the race to the moon, right, to try to get to the first person on the moon over the course of the 60s, and we'll talk about that next semester. But it freaked a lot of people out, Sputnik. It was one of these things, its orbit obviously was very low, so you could see it, and it freaked a lot of people out. They didn't know what all it could do or whatever, and Little Richard took it as an omen. So he returned, he left the tour early, and he returned home, and when he looked up the flight that he was originally supposed to be on, it went down and crashed, and he would have died on it. So he took all this as a sign from God that he was doing the wrong thing. Remember, his father kind of indoctrinated him with the idea that his pursuits, his theatrical pursuits, were leading him straight to hell. So he quit. He quit rock and roll. He quit entertainment. He went to theology school for a few years, and he joined the ministry. And you can even see footage of him on YouTube. There are some videos of him delivering sermons, and Little Richard delivering your sermon, and it's pretty much what you might think it would be. It's very engaging and very theatrical in its own way, and of course he sang in the church and so on. And so he dropped out in 57. He's by 58 he's out of rock and roll, right? And we'll see next time that this sort of accumulates, all these people that are dropping out or dying from rock and roll, and the rock and roll era really ends there in the 50s. And again, Little Richard returns. He makes many returns, as you probably already know, to the music industry. And he makes his first return in the 60s, just like Chuck Berry was, and he's put on that nostalgia circuit. And really, that's the rest of his career. I mean, yeah, he shows up on, American Idol and so on, but very much as part of this sort of nostalgia, this way of looking at this era that really only lasted for roughly 5 years, the rock and roll era from roughly 1955 to 59, 60, early 60, and then it's gone. And so it's no wonder that the people of my parents' generation look back at this as this sort of glory moment of all this idealism, and you can see the romanticization of the idea that this was what broke down segregation. It's not. That's romanticization, and it's nice to think so. The famous line from the end of The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway, right? Isn't it pretty to think so? And yes, it is pretty to think so. And it's not that it didn't have any impact on segregation and so on, but it didn't have the impact that we might like to think that it did. In fact, in some ways, what I think happened with, what I think we can demonstrate happened with rock and roll is it was sort of a safety valve for a lot of people. It was harmless rebellion. It was the kind of rebellion that's often offered in especially a tamped down society the way the 50s was. The 50s was a conformist society. And so having these little valve releases, these little pressure releases, that's an important part. It's not to dismiss entertainment and art, popular art. It's just saying that popular art can serve a whole lot of uses. We'll return to some of this in our last session, which will be next time. See you then.